After an impressive 2-0 start to their season, the New Orleans Saints looked like one of the best teams in the NFL. But since then, they have lost 5 straight games and everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. So in today's video, I want to talk about what has led up to this point for the New Orleans Saints and what's going to happen with this team moving forward. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the New Orleans Saints. We're not just going to talk about their first 7 games of the season, but we're also going to talk about the remainder of their schedule and what they could potentially do in the offseason to right the ship. But of course, if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, make sure you guys hit the like and subscribe button. But let's go ahead and start off by talking about their season. So as I mentioned, they started the year off really well with 2 dominant victories over the Carolina Panthers and Dallas Cowboys. And after those first 2 weeks, many of us, and I would say rightfully so, put them in their top 10. Because at the time, the Carolina Panthers were thought to be a better version of what they were last year. Obviously, that hasn't really been the case, but of course, you got to add the context of the times. And then in week 2, you beat up on the Dallas Cowboys, who, by the way, the Dallas Cowboys were coming off a victory against the Browns, who at the same time, we also thought were a good team. Turns out the Cowboys aren't so much of a good team, but we did think that Dallas was a good team at that point. So your first 2 victories were up against 2 bad teams, at least we know that now, but in context, we thought those were maybe some competitive teams, and you were 2-0, and then you looked at the remainder of their schedule, and you did see some competitive games, but you thought that they actually stood a chance in most of those games. In fact, if you go back to, I think, my week 2 reaction video, I was talking about this Saints team, and I was talking about their remainder schedule, and I said that I thought the Saints were going to be able to win some of these matchups. But boy, I was wrong, and a lot of other people were wrong too. They would go on to lose to the Eagles by 3 points. They would lose to the Falcons by 2, losing to the Chiefs by 13. The Buccaneers flat out embarrassed them. And then, of course, on Thursday night, the Broncos dominated them as well. Now, you can go into each individual game and point out what actually led to them losing those games. For example, the offense really let them down against the Eagles. Then in the Falcons game, they just had a couple mishaps that were just completely out of nowhere. And then in that Chiefs game, that's just a really good Chiefs team that can grind out a victory. And then the Buccaneers, you can point out to the Derek Carr injury. But I feel like at this point, we're just starting to level and put more excuses on top of each other. I'm not trying to minimize those excuses, but it feels like at this point, we're just coming up with more excuses as to why the Saints team is losing. Now, I do want to go into some of those excuses and reasons as to why the Saints are actually struggling, because I feel like it's extremely important that we at least talk about them. The biggest reason why the Saints team has had a massive collapse has just been injuries. The big catalyst for those first 2 games where the Saints won was the interior offensive line, was guys like Lucas Patrick, Cesar Ruiz, McCoy as well. And so your interior offensive line was really good. And then Ruiz went out with a knee injury. And then, of course, Lucas Patrick went out with a chest injury. And it's been kind of just hit and miss every single day with those guys. You just don't know when you're going to get them back. The interior offensive line played such a pivotal role because of what they were able to do with Alvin Kamara and the ground game. And because this team hasn't been able to actually effectively run the ball, it's been really hard for this offense to actually do much of anything. Because a lot of what this offense wants to do is they want to run the ball effectively on 1st and 2nd down, then on play action, and then on 3rd down or 2nd down or whenever, you can run play action. You can work the RPOs, and hell, you can take some deep shots to Rashid Shaheed, who is also injured. And if you actually look at their week 7 injury report, it is ridiculous how many injuries they actually have to not just guys, but like true legitimate stars. Derek Carr is out, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed, like I mentioned, many of the offensive linemen, plenty of their defensive players. I mean, it is a plethora of injuries that this team just simply can't overcome. And when you look at the remainder of their schedule, it's not like it's going to get that much easier for this team. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of these guys are going to continue to miss time, and this team still has some stiff competition to go up against. Next week, you have the Chargers. I think that's a loss. Then you have the Panthers. I'm going to give you a win on that one. Then you have the Falcons, the Browns, the Rams, the Giants, the Commanders. Maybe you could win 2 or 3 of those matchups. That's actually kind of an easy stretch. But then you end the season off with the Packers, the Raiders, and the Buccaneers. 2 of those teams are really good. And because you're 2-5, I think it's pretty fair to say that your season is basically over with. Because barring this team just going on an absolute tear with either Rattler at quarterback or Derek Carr or Jake Hayner or whoever, this team is going to find a way to lose at least 2 more games. So if you lose 2 more games, at best, you're 10-7. And I don't know if 10-7 gets you into the wild card. And that's just being being completely optimistic because I don't think this team is going to go on a tear. I think they're likely going to lose the majority of these games on their schedule. Honestly, I kind of think that's maybe best case scenario for this team. If you were to go like 10-7 and miss the playoffs, then you're sitting kind of middle in the pack and you're not going to have a top 20 draft pick and you're going to lose a lot of players and just not going to work really well for you. Whereas if your team actually does suck, then maybe potentially you could get a top 20 pick. And if you look at that 2025 draft class with guys that this team could potentially take, I think there's a lot of different guys who could really help this Saints team out right away. This is a Saints team that is pretty old. Yes, they have some younger guys like Olave, Fuanga, Kool-Aid McKinstry, so on and so forth, but you also have a bunch of older guys. And let's now actually go into those older guys because I feel like we already know their season is over with, and they're probably going to be a team that ends up with like a top 15 draft pick moving forward. But I think something that's maybe a bit more interesting about looking forward for the future is looking at the contract situations for some of those older guys that I've talked about. Right now, as of when I'm making this video, if you look at their 2025 team cap space, they currently sit at negative $81 million. But fortunately for them, they have a bunch of contracts that they could get off by either cutting them post or pre-June 1st. And hell, you could also extend some players. You can also trade some players. Like, you can get out of these contracts pretty easily to get under that cap space number. So if you're looking for kind of a brief overview, that's that. If you look at post June 1st, you can cut Alvin Kamara and save $25 million. If you want to cut Marshawn Lattimore, you can save $20 million. Cameron Jordan, $11 million. Derek Carr, $30 million. Ryan Ramczyk, $18 million. Taysom Hill, $10 million. And so many other players can get you a bunch of other millions of dollars as well. The same thing also does apply for some players if you want to cut them pre-June 1st, because I do believe there is some limit as to how many players you can cut post-June 1st. If you look at Alvin Kamara, that's $18 million. Marshawn Lattimore, $10 million. Ryan Ramczyk, $6 million. Obviously, not as much as if you would cut them post-June 1st, but obviously you might end up cutting some of these guys anyway, so you have to kind of maneuver around that June 1st timeline. And I know that a lot of those players are good. And hell, a lot of those players are their best players on this team. Alvin Kamara, maybe the best player on this team. Marshawn Lattimore, still a great player. Cameron Jordan, the heart and soul of this team. Taysom Hill, Demario Davis, Eric McCoy, so many other of those players. Yes, those are great players. I understand that completely, but you're negative $81 million in cap space. You're going to bring in a whole bunch of fresh new blood in this draft class. I kind of feel like now more than ever is the best time to hit the reset button for the Saints team. Because you've been middle of the pack with Dennis Allen, and this year you also kind of feel like you're middle of the pack. And so now you have an opportunity to, like I said, hit the reset button, fire your head coach, go out there and cut a bunch of these players, trade some of these players, extend some of these guys to open up some cap space to pursue younger, more talented players. And hell, you can also maybe trade some of these guys like Alvin Kamara or Marshawn Lattimore or whoever to try to accumulate some more draft picks. I feel like if there was ever a time for the Saints team to hit the reset button, it would be now. Now, I know this is a franchise and a front office that doesn't want to hit the reset button and seems optimistic about what their future is, but I have to imagine that at some point reality will set in with them. You're 2-5. Yes, you're injured, but that's not a legitimate excuse. Dennis Allen is not a good coach. Your two wins this season were up against two of the worst defenses in the entire NFL. And sure, you can try and sit here and tell me, well, you know, if you just let this team get healthy, they're going to be back to where they were in weeks 1 and 2. Maybe, but that is a huge assumption that you're making that one, those guys can stay healthy at their age, and two, you're also kind of just coping with the fact that you beat two bad teams. So I feel like you just have to let reality set in here. You beat up on two bad teams. Your team is heavily overpaid. You don't have the talent to seriously contend in the NFC. And if you look at your own division, the NFC South, the Buccaneers are a great team. The Atlanta Falcons are looking like a much improved team. And sure, the Carolina Panthers still freaking suck, but they'll eventually figure things out. And for the Saints team, you're falling further and further and further down the rankings of your division, and you're also paying your team more and more money. So if you're asking me what moves would I make in the offseason, I'm not 100% quite yet sure. Obviously, we have plenty of time to talk about that. Once this season is over with and a couple weeks after that, we'll start talking about that. But as I sit here today, I look at this team and just say, hit the reset button. Find a young head coach that can develop a team. Go out there and find some younger talent to replace some of your older veterans. You don't need Derek Carr. You don't need Cameron Jordan. You don't need Lattimore. You don't need Kamara, because at the end of the day, you're just hoarding talent for the sake of actually having them instead of finding ways to actually improve your team. Those are great players, but they're not helping you win a championship because those great players cost so much. So if you were to get rid of those guys, you can afford to pay more important players at more important positions while also prioritizing improvement on your younger players. You can develop younger guys and give them more opportunities on the football field by not having some of these older guys. Yes, your team is good when healthy, but it's obviously not a great team. Even in those first 2 victories, we knew maybe that this team was maybe somewhat overrated. And the last little thing I'll talk about here is, well, what do you do with Spencer Rattler? Listen, I like Spencer Rattler. I think he's a good kid who's matured and is becoming a pretty solid quarterback in the NFL. But let's just keep it a buck here. He's not a starting quarterback guy, and he was drafted in the 5th round for a reason. The Saints currently are having an issue with the quarterback position because you're paying Derek Carr, and the fan base is quite frankly just not happy with Derek Carr and his performance. So they obviously want to move off of him, and Spencer Rattler seems like this shiny new toy that can be something. And sure, maybe you could develop him into being that really good shiny toy that ends up being the quarterback of the future. That definitely could happen. But again, I just want to emphasize with you guys, he was a 5th round pick for a reason. His development is going to be slower than somebody like Caleb or obviously Jaden Daniels. And I just don't believe that he has the talent to match up with some of these other great quarterbacks who are going to end up being in Super Bowl conversations. So sure, you could ride with him for another year and just kind of tank for higher draft picks as overall you're hitting the reset button. And I don't think that's a terrible idea, because I look at the 2025 quarterback class and I just don't think it's all that great. So sure, you could rock with Spencer Rattler for a year, see how that goes. It probably won't end up well, but that should be fine because you're a resetting team. You're a team that's looking to rebuild. So if you want to do that, go ahead. I wouldn't suggest doing that. I actually kind of think Jake Haener at this point might be the better quarterback moving forward, but obviously time will tell. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, what do you guys think about this New Orleans Saints team? Should they hit the reset button, or should we just be a bit more optimistic about this team if they can get healthy? And again, if you enjoy, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.